Morning, it's 8:21 and you're listening to YKDO Morning News. Today's segment focuses on a recent event at Highland Park Middle School. We look to Danny, who has more on the story.
Thank you, Yoni. In a 20-second video taken by students at Highland Park Middle School on May 8th, Wendy Berlowski, a Spanish teacher, can be heard using a derogatory racial slur. Let's take a look at the video.
I just walk around the room and I just pick on them.
Well,
Because they're black. And they're the only doing any work. I know. I'm sorry.
No. That's what you've been saying. That's it. She's repeating what you're saying. But
I'm sorry.
Dante Suttle, a parent of one of the students involved, took responsibility for posting the video to social media. Suttle said that 3 students, including his daughter, had been working in the hallway when Berlowski kicked out one of her students from the classroom. As the 3 students consoled the other student that was kicked out, Berlowski found herself back in the hallway to reprimand them. The resulting conversation became heated. Suttle's daughter was traumatized with a newfound sense of fear following this incident, and she did not attend school the week afterward. Suttle said that his goal is to ensure that an incident like this does not occur ever again in St. Paul Public Schools, and he wants to improve communication throughout the public school district, as well as hire more African American teachers in the district. Another parent of a student involved, Brandy Coleman, told YKDO affiliate CARE that the posted video was the culmination of ongoing tensions between her daughter and Berlowski, calling her other racial slurs in the past. After calling the video disturbing, St. Paul Public School District Superintendent Joe Gothard issued a statement saying,
"No matter the situation, foul and racist language has no place in SPPS. As educators, we have to be held to a higher standard. And we know that this situation represents a failure on our part. And we will not fall silent in the face of racism in our schools. And we will not make excuses for the harm this causes the children that you place in our care. I apologize to you, and I can assure you that we are taking appropriate actions and conducting a thorough review of this situation. It's up to us to repair harm, to rebuild trust, to work together as a community in service of educating our children. Thank you."
2 days after the video was posted, Berlowski, who was hired in 2013, was placed on paid administrative leave and resigned on May 20th, according to school officials. Berlowski declined to comment.
Before we move forward to discuss the use of the N-word in other classroom settings, let's take a step back and understand the history behind this word. There is no clear consensus on when the derogatory term materializes. Some believe that it comes from the mispronunciation of the Spanish word for black, and as a mispronunciation became derogatory and abusive. Others believe that the term was used to describe African slaves, and since slaves were viewed as inferior, the term thereby became something derogatory used to describe African American people. However, since those times, the use of the N-word has now become virtually unacceptable. In an interview, Arizona State University professor Neil A. Lester, who has taught courses on the N-word, said, "There's no way to know all of its nuances because it's such a complicated word, a word with a particular radicalized American history. But one way of getting at it is to have some critical and historical discussions about it, and not to pretend that it doesn't exist. We also cannot pretend that there is not a double standard, that blacks can say it without much social consequence, but whites cannot. There is a double standard about a lot of stuff. There are certain things that I would never say. In my relationship with my wife, who is not African American, I would never imagine her using that word, no matter how angry she was with me. That's all I'm asking people to do, to self-reflect critically on how we all use language and the extent to which language is a reflection of our innermost thoughts." Lester further argues that teachers who might have used that term in the classroom accidentally should reflect on that use because he believes letting such a term slip out, such a loaded term slip out, could be problematic for the classroom.
In an article discussing the use of the N-word, Randall Kennedy warns against determining a zero tolerance of the N-word in modern society. In response to pieces of literature that are excluded from curriculum by educators in high school, including books like Huckleberry Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird, Kennedy warns that this could have problematic impacts on works of African American literature, such as Richard Wright's Black Boy and Malcolm X's autobiography. He writes, in 1936, the bureaucrat in charge of black schools in Washington, D.C. recommended barring from the schools a magazine that printed the N-word in its pages. What was that magazine? None other than Opportunity, the organ of the National Urban League, and for years one of the leading platforms for the publication of serious literature by Black American writers. What Shipp and others who wish to eradicate the N-word fail adequately to recognize is the term's linguistic richness and the extraordinary extent to which it has insinuated itself for bad, but also for good across the wide expanse of the American cultural landscape. In October 2018, a very different incident involving the N-word occurred at Augsburg University. Our reporter Yonit has more information.
History and Medieval Studies professor Philip Adamo recently was suspended for using the N-word during a class discussion sparked from James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, in which the N-word is used. Adamo asked his students if it would be acceptable in an academic setting to ever use the N-word and not its euphemism. In the process of asking his students this question, Adamo did use the N-word himself, and then he assigned the students 2 essays on the subject. In his next class, several students came unannounced and who were not enrolled in Adamo's class came to investigate what had happened in the previous interactions. They then recorded Adamo without his knowledge and published that video on YouTube. Here are some interactions captured by that recording.
The conversation is not whether or not we should read James Baldwin. The conversation is the use of the N-word in that class. And while, yes, a student may have used the N-word, does not mean you as a professor had to regurgitate that. Because, as you know, as conversations last year, they set precedent for how we feel as students about it. So, there was no, if you were asking the question of context, you had no need to say the N-word. But you overstepped boundaries and you said the N-word, and that is a conversation we are having right now because of what happened last year. And you repeated that episode in the morning class and again in the afternoon class. So that is it's not about whether or not we should read James Baldwin. It's about the fact that you use N-word in multiple years. It's not about how you said it. It's the fact that you simply said it.
Okay. So I will tell you that I find that problematic.
Okay.
Because I do think that utterances like that exist in a context. And many students in the class, I can't remember at what point in the description you came in, so I'm maybe repeating things that you've already heard. But in the morning class and the afternoon class, students of color said there are some contexts where this is okay. One student in this class said it's a term of endearment in some communities. Now, I don't know that. I'm not part of those communities.
After the interactions with these student leaders, Adamo then reported the incident to his provost, who recommended he write a letter to the leaders in this honors program. Adamo wrote to them expressing support for the ways that they stood up for their values and for the things that they believed in, but he also warned them against the methods that they used, such as recording him without his knowledge and coming unannounced and uninvited to his class. Following the incident, in a controversial response, Adamo was suspended. Adamo's colleagues had several responses. Some, including English Department Chair Robert Cowgill, defended him. Cowgill wrote in a letter to the editor to the Augsburg student newspaper, The Echo, in November 2018, along with other members of the Minnesota chapter of the American Association of University Professors, the AAUP. Is the utterance of a racially charged, offensive word in an academic context always worthy of censure? Context makes all the difference. The word in this case was spoken when an Augsburg professor asked students how to engage the language and ideas in James Baldwin's seminal work, The Fire Next Time, which itself uses the word for critical examination of the racism behind it. The AAUP has always defended academic freedom in the form of speech in the classroom. Academic freedom, which applies to all participants in the classroom, includes the right to engage difficult topics. Even potentially triggering or offensive speech, if relevant to a course's subject or reading material, is covered by the blanket value of academic freedom. Other Augsburg faculty wrote in support of the students and against the use of academic freedom as a defense for using the N-word and not its euphemism in the classroom. We, the undersigned Augsburg faculty, acknowledge that Professor Phil Adamo's repeated use of the N-word has caused harm to our students. This term, the most violent and racially charged word in American culture, has historically been used in the U.S. by white people to dehumanize and humiliate black people. We also acknowledge that this harm was intensified when Adamo defended his use of the N-word multiple times against the objections of students of color. Academic freedom in defense of language that harms students turns the very principle that makes true learning possible into a mechanism for enforcing institutional racism. The incident illustrates the urgent need for many of our faculty to be more self-critical in their positions of power, and racial as well as gender and other forms of privilege. Furthermore, it underscores the very real power of words to cause damage and trauma. We believe that further conversations about academic freedom can only take place after we acknowledge that harm has been done to these students. The AAUP emphasizes that academic freedom is fundamental for the protection of the rights of the teacher in teaching and of the student to freedom in learning. We believe that freedom in learning for students means freedom from racism, from harassment, from discrimination, from oppression, and from trauma at the hands of faculty and the university.
These two situations are not the only examples of the use of the N-word in an academic setting. Earlier this year at St. Louis Park High School, a social studies teacher used the N-word in a tense conversation with students after class. According to sophomore Grace Kanyinku, a group of girls working on a project were also having a conversation at the same time, with much profanity used, which made the teacher believe they were not getting their project done. Kanyinku, who was in the class, said that at the end of the hour, the teacher approached the students to understand why they were using such harsh language. When asked the specific language she was referring to, the teacher repeated all of the obscene language, including the N-word itself.
So I was like, why did you say that? And then she said, because the girls were saying it. And these girls is a group of 3 black girls. Mm-hmm. So obviously they're allowed to say it. But so she was saying that because they had said the N-word, she thought it was okay that she could say it. And I said, well, you're a history teacher, you know the history of the word, you know why it's wrong, so why would you say it? And she said, well, because she was saying it, and she kept saying that as if that was an excuse, when a whole time it isn't. She got very defensive, which I didn't like, but when I had time to think about it, it's really a basic human impulse to become defensive, you know? So I understood it, but I feel like she should have been more level-headed as an adult, as a history teacher, more so. The day after, when kids had responded, I feel like no one wanted to get anything done. They just wanted to be angry at her, have a reason to yell at a teacher without real consequences. I feel like really people were talking at her, yelling at her, not trying to talk with her, not trying to move towards it. And then Monday, Tuesday, and I believe that Wednesday after, the principal, Mr. Myers, as well as another lady came, and we talked about how we felt, and we had an open conversation. And now the atmosphere definitely has shifted. I used to feel like I had a connection with her as far as a teacher. I feel like I really could come to her for things, and the fact that she had the capacity to say that even if it was on impulse kind of set me back, you know. It kind of made me feel like, oh no, I can't trust her, you know. I feel like if you have even the slightest part of your brain to think that that's okay to especially say the hard ER, that there's no place for trust.
In response to the recent incident at Augsburg University, Kanyinku said while she believes the use of the word was unacceptable, the consequences were too harsh.
I think because it was educational purposes, it wasn't like with malicious intent that he said it, that it should have been 2 semesters, because bottom line is that's his way of money. That's how he puts food on the table. That's how he gets things paid. I feel like 2 semesters was a bit extensive, maybe a semester, a quarter, or something like that, as well as these open conversations that we had. I also think he should have let the class know, okay, I'm going to say the N-word, it's strictly for educational purposes. I don't mean it towards anybody. I don't mean to abuse the right or anything like that.
St. Louis Park High School social studies teacher Brad Brubaker said he acknowledges that in historical context, educators and students might come across the word when researching primary source documents.
For me personally, what I've done in my class is I've tried to identify that word and other similar words for other groups of people as You know, that could be a word that's derogatory towards homosexuals. It could be a word that's derogatory towards a religious group or towards an ethnic group, racial group, that we don't want to give voice to, or, you know, basically don't want to give power to the voice of oppressors. So if that's the term that's used to degrade people, I've kind of said, even though we run across it and it might be there, we try to substitute it with some equivalent.
I think if you're reading a book and it's for educational purposes and like a primary source in history or a book in English or anything like that, if it has the N-word present, letting the class know, okay, I'm going to that, but sometimes even in that case you can really just say the N-word, not the actual word.
I think that you have to be conscious that people are going to hear things very, very differently, depending on the lenses that they're looking at the world through. So I think that I want to defer to not offending. So if it's going to offend one, I typically will just, you know, unless I really think, man, this has to be part of my curriculum, you know, if I'm going to offend one, I'm going to stay away, maybe even from topic. You know, I've never felt it was appropriate. And, you know, so this is not a new concept. I mean, I've never lived in a time when that term was appropriate and not derogatory. So I've never felt it belonged in my classroom.
I see a lot on social media about how white people usually, and sometimes even Hispanic people in my own life, they feel that for Hispanic people, because they're also people of color, that they can say the N-word. Or for white people, they say, oh, it's just a word. It was a long time ago. Like, stop holding on to history, that kind of thing. I feel like they haven't done the research, and I feel like before you go on saying words that had such a horrible and bloody history to it, you should do your research to it. And I'm not saying, you know, go on every single website ever made about the N-word and why you should or should not say it. I'm just saying do a little bit of research on some different websites with different viewpoints and make your own well-constructed view there. Not, oh, because my dad said it, it's okay, or because my mom never saw anything wrong with it, it's alright, or if because my friend said it the other day, I think it's okay, you know? More making your own choices, I feel like can really help people learn about the N-word and why they shouldn't say it.
This incident and its responses that concern the use of the N-word in the academic setting pose a serious question. Is the N-word ever acceptable in an academic setting, and what are the limitations on academic freedom if speaking such a word is not? I'm Unique Krebs.
And I'm Danny Orloff, and you're watching YKDO Morning News.
Thank you, and have a great day.